All right. Well, welcome to podcast six, A Dad Talks to Dads. This is our series regarding how to raise our children in challenging times in a biblical way. And we are utilizing a book written by J.C. Ryle called A Duty for Parents. And anyway, so this principle that we're going to be discussing today, principle number six, is probably the most important um, uh, principle that we need to get right as parents, that we need to get right in helping our children get this principle correct, because it is the most I don't know, it's like confusing, but um, it's all over the map as regard to what is a success, what a successful prayer. Well, what does that look like? And that's what we're going to be discussing is the principle about prayer, and how we should be training our children in that direction. I think it's probably difficult because so many of us struggle with it. Yet we know its importance, and I think some of us don't know how to approach it well, or think about it, or how to view it. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So again, if you are wanting to get the book, you can go to Amazon, download the Kindle, and you can get the books for free. And you can read J.C. Ryle's commentaries on the principles that we are covering. So, again, we are covering 17 Principles, the Duties of Parents by J.C. Ryle. So, with that, let's go to the very principle that we're talking about, and that is train them in a habit of prayer. That's the principle that we're going to be learning today. Uh, as parents, we know the importance of prayer. As Christian parents, I'm sure that everybody understands it. Um, but for some people, or a lot of people, it for some reason there's not a connection there. It's almost as though we still treat it as though uh, kind of a ambiance, or a vague part of our spirituality, but not quite sure, um, where, how to measure it, how to gauge it, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. I think prayer is, again, key and essential, and um, without a doubt, um, a part of our spiritual walk that cannot be dismissed, because prayer is communicating with God in a very specific way, even though we don't always know what to say. It is specific because of who we go to and why we go to Him, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, with that, let's go to what J.C. Ryle said in regards to what he thinks that prayer is one great secret of spiritual prosperity. Now, I'm going to say this. He does not mean prosperity in the sense of gold and silver and a very large bank account. He's talking about your knowledge of God, your experience with God, your knowing of Him specifically. In other words, you're able to uh, draw nearer to God in such a way where things um, are really more underneath in priorities, um, and God is above all those things, because that's one of the things we really struggle with. Things in our lives, things grabbing our attention, either in our thoughts or in our hearts, or in our lives, obligations. Uh, they're drawing on us. They're trying to become priorities in our lives. The world is always trying to introduce something to make a priority in life, and prayer is one of those things that it's going to try to rob you from, because prayer is the key to really knowing who God is and knowing his thoughts, his ways, and his will. And um, so that is one of the things that we need to, as parents, understand and help our children understand that as well, and try to teach it to them in that light. So anyway, again, we're going to kind of go over this a little bit with some of the points that we're bringing to attention. And again, I just wanted to address that I understand that prayer, can be a struggle. But maybe if I introduce some thoughts of how we should be approaching it, maybe it'll be more helpful. And so we'll see how that goes. But hopefully they will be helpful to you. But let's look at a couple of scriptures here. The first one I want to look at is in Daniel chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Now, let me set this up for you. Uh, Daniel is under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar is not a Christian man. He's not a godly man for sure. He has a dream. He cannot interpret. He wants to know what it means. And so he calls upon his magicians, and his magician says, "Well, I don't know what it is. Nope, nobody can understand or interpret that." And he says, "Well, heads are going to roll if nobody can tell me what this dream means." I'm paraphrasing, but basically everybody was in trouble because he was just that kind of a guy. Anyway, so uh, Daniel gets wind of this, and he responds in such a way that he tells the people that are informing him of this, "Please give me time, and I will come back, and let you know what God says." And I'm paraphrasing it. Please read the story. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is Daniel's response and in character, and his response in regards to he goes to prayer, and taking a look at why he does that specifically. So here's the verse. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. The mystery meaning the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, one of the things is it seems like self-preservation, but I don't see it that way, because in order for this to happen, um, per, Daniel is looking to God to preserve everyone so they don't get into the mix. And there is some element of self-preservation, but in other words, they're going to call upon God that this favor of God, or what they're requesting God, be granted to everybody. And so, it's a big prayer request that Daniel's asking. But there are two things I want to again emphasize here. One is Daniel's character. Um, Daniel responds in saying, "Give me time to go to my friends, so I may respond to the king." And the confidence that Daniel demonstrates also should demonstrate to us the type of confidence that we should have in going to God. In other words, that should be our go-to. Now, obviously, this is one of those common things that we go to God to, is when we're in trouble, when things are going awry, or things are going in a bad direction. We tend to go to God. And I don't want to say that's abnormal. Again, if my garage was being broken into, or my house was being broken into, I'm going to call the police. Okay, I'm going to call somebody who can do something about it. Okay, um, and so the same thing here. Daniel's knowing who to go to for this situation. But the second point lines up with probably the most important part, is how he goes to God. It doesn't say he goes in prayer, but that is implicated. It's implicit that he is praying to God, but he's praying to God specifically for his compassion. And so what we're seeing here is Daniel knowing who to go to, what to ask of God specifically, knowing that this is God's capability and will to provide compassion to us. We know that, but it demonstrates the objective of prayer is to really get that familiar with God. That our responses, whether it's a tragedy or something not going right in your life, or something that you need wisdom for, or just something that is happening in your life and you want to express it to God, whether it's a sad situation or even a grateful situation. The point is that God is such a priority in Daniel's life because he is drawing closer to God through prayer. So the prayer life of Daniel is actually helping him prioritize God in his life to where he's going back to him and looking to him first and foremost. And that is the objective. And he knows what to ask of God, his compassion in this case. If you look at some of the stories of David, David went to God in specific ways. Psalm 51, don't take away your Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me a brand new spirit, okay? Restore unto me, God. He knew what to ask of God because of his prayer life. And I think that's the struggle for a lot of us. We don't know what to or how to go to God. And there are a couple of reasons for that. But basically, I just want to set out the objective. I'm not saying that we should be, there's that term prayer warriors, and okay, there are people who pray probably way more than I do, but I don't think that's a reserved position in the Christian life. I think what Daniel has is not only available to every Christian, um, but it's provided to every Christian, that ability to know God that way, because that's who God is. He is the one who's granted us the ability to pray. He does. And I think to our shame somewhat, we don't utilize that or think of it that way. We just think of it as, well, it's just part of the Christian walk. And we don't treat it the way that we should. In other words, the ability to know God in such a close way where it affects us, like the way it affected Daniel, to be able to respond the way he did and go to God and be able to talk to him and request of him, along with his three companions, how to navigate through that situation. And I don't want to um, prolong that point, but I think it's, again, I'm emphasizing that how Daniel responded and how Daniel requested of God was was um, was because of his prayer life, because he knew who to ask for and what he can expect from God if God so desired to give the compassion, but he knew what to give to God, to what to request of God, and he did it. And so read the story, and you can see how that story goes and how God fulfills that prayer request to Daniel. Okay, the next verse is probably a common one. It's from Thessalonians. It's from Paul, uh, verse 16 and 17 and 18. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Okay, that pray without ceasing. Again, this helps us understand that prayer is not just uh, reserved for when we're in trouble. It's not reserved for saying grace at the table. Okay, it's not reserved for funerals. It's something that should be a part of life, and we're going to kind of get to that point a little bit in the next couple of slides. But again, that prayer without ceasing, it's prayer is not a special occasion, although prayer can be a special occasion, but prayer should be a consistent thing in our lives. And that's what's important to understand at this point. Okay, so the first point I want to talk about is prayer is key to knowing God and His ways, and I was just explaining that with Daniel. Um, the prayer of Daniel demonstrates, in just those few verses. And again, if you read the book of Daniel, you I'm not off base at all on this in regards to how the prayer life affected Daniel. Now, yeah, will we ever rise to the occasion of being captured, by you know some sinister regime, and maybe, and having to bow down to them? Maybe, I don't know. What would we call to to be that type of person for that? I don't know. What I do know is this: that what Daniel had in relationship with God through prayer is available to all of us, and God desires that. And the point here being that um, the objective of prayer is to have that type of closeness with God, that you're getting to know the infiniteness of Himself, because you can't really know everything about God, and knowing His ways in your life. And that's what's key in prayer. That's its objective. The second point here is that prayer needs to be a spiritual discipline. And this is the part I think everybody struggles with, because I think there's this element that prayer needs to be, you know, um, spontaneous. It needs to be organic or dynamic, and it needs to be, flowery, or it needs to be expressive, and it needs to be genuine and sincere. And that's, yes, those are good qualities to have in prayer. But here's the reality: we're flesh. Many of us, when we know we should be praying, don't, because something has got our attention, something with has um, something that we find more important than praying. Or here's the element. Here's the point of that: is that we think prayer can be put off. Imagine if Daniel did that. I don't think we'd be reading the book of Daniel. If Daniel had put it off in chapter 2, I think that's where the book of Daniel would have ended. The fact that Daniel knew what to do, I don't think, maybe there was expressed of fear. There was expressed of, oh boy, this is bad. We got to get to it, and so he was motivated um, by that. But some of us are not thinking that we need to be motivated by something, to prayer, and that's what Thessalonians says. Thessalonians says prayer without ceasing. It needs to be a spiritual a habit. It needs to be a spiritual discipline. And here's the crux of this: God already knows that you don't want to pray. You're not going to catch God off surprise. Don't think you're going to come to God in, some formative way, and say, "Oh God, I'm here because I really want to be here." But yet, I'm thinking about, well, there's a game that's going to start in 5 minutes that I would really like to watch. There's some friends that are going out, and I need to get this done in 10 minutes. Don't think that God doesn't know that. Don't think that God doesn't see your heart and your mind, and know that your priorities are somewhere else. And that's exactly what I was just saying in the beginning, is the fact that the prayer is what helps you draw closer to God and make Him your number one priority, where everything else becomes secondary and least important to who He is and what He wants to share with you, from, as far as blessing you. Again, what J.C. Ryle says, being prosperous in your heart and in your mind. Just remember that that's what you're giving up. So here's what I suggest: when you're in those times, be honest with God. Say, God, you know what? I'd rather be reading a newspaper. I'd rather be out with my friends. I'd rather be doing something else that, that's in my heart, that's gravitating to that. Don't think that God doesn't know what even the enemy is putting in your thoughts. But the point is, if you ask God, not that alleviates, how you feel at that point of not wanting to be there, but the fact that you realize that God is being gracious to you for feeling that way, even being that way when you're talking to him and praying to him. And so basically you just humble yourself and say, God, I understand that my hearts are not in the right place. I understand that you know that you are not the priority that you should be. But God, thank you very much for this element of Christianity, this gift that you've given to us in prayer to communicate with you through the Holy Spirit, that can change. That will change, God. Help me discipline myself. Help me get this going so that my heart is towards you, like Daniel was towards you and David was towards you. That I am prospering in my heart. I want to get to that part. Make that your objective. Make that your quest. That you want to not only glorify God, but enjoy who God is for the days that you're here on earth. And hopefully, again, that helps. Again, what we're going to talk about in training your children in the habit. Let me share a story about a famous minister, David Wilkerson. It's in his book, the Sword and the Switchblade. It's in the beginning, and this is prior to his Teen Challenge ministry. This is prior to his fame with Nikki Cruz and that experience. And here's what happened with him, because he will convey and agree with me with what I'm telling you about prayer is the necessity of drawing closer to God and knowing his ways and his thoughts. Okay, knowing Him. And um, what he did is he used to love westerns, and he would spend hours watching westerns. And I don't remember all the details, but there was a point in his life where he said, I, something needs to give, because my spiritual life, my work and my ministry is just not, it's not prospering. I'm just paraphrasing. You can read it in the book yourself. And so what he did was he spoke with God, recognizing that his priorities were not with him. His priorities were with the westerns, with the TV. So he got rid of the TV, sold the TV. Yeah, he sold the TV, and he says, God, the amount of time I spent each day with on the westerns, I will give to you in prayer. It was after that that he had the experience with Nikki Cruz, and that Teen Challenge was born. Isn't that cool? I love that story. I think it's a great story, because you know what, David Wilkerson wasn't didn't become a great man without God. He didn't become a shining light in a lot of men and women's life through Teen Challenge without God. And all he did was commit his heart to praying and communing with God and making him his priority and recognizing prayer was the only way it was going to happen. And I guarantee you, and I think in the book he describes it too, that he struggled. He struggled. I mean, what were you going to pray? What were all that time? It didn't happen overnight. It developed. And for some of us, um, in our microwave culture, we think things should be automatic. It doesn't happen overnight, but it needs to start happening for sure. All right, third and last point. Prayer is a sign of trust and gratitude, and that kind of goes into everything I've just been saying. The way Daniel responded, the what Paul encourages us to do is to trust God. That's what you're doing. You're trusting God. It's like, God, I don't know what to do in a situation, but you do. God, I don't know what to do about my heart. I don't know how to do with this. Well, let's start with your priorities, like David Wilkerson. Let's start somewhere. I know what to do. Trust. And the other part of it is gratitude. I think it's important not to be grateful to God when he answers your prayer, but when you enter into prayer. Go into prayer not with just a trust, but a gratitude because of who he is, knowing that it's going to work out to the way that it should have worked out, in the way that God desires it to work out. You don't know everything. I don't know everything. Some things are very clear, but sometimes people I think, have a tendency to only be grateful if they have a praise report. I think you can have a praise report before it even happens, before the prayer is even answered, and that's what we should have, and I think that will be helpful. So those are two great things I think that will be helpful in regards to uh, you know, developing your prayer life, to knowing God, his heart, and drawing closer and being prosperous in your heart, in your spiritual walk, in your life, emotionally and mentally. Okay. And because here's where we're going to go with this. Because here's the question that we're posing to ourselves. Do you need to work on your prayer habit with your children? I want to say this. If you noticed, this whole session was focused on you and not so much the children, because this is not some you can't teach this in a workbook form. You can't sit down like you sit down in a Bible study and explain, about the attributes of God, or explain, the story of the Good Samaritan, or Goliath story with your children, okay, and how to respond and behave. Remember a long time ago in the last podcast, I said, we make it more about um, be, mo- be, behavior modification rather than a heart issue. And it is a heart issue, and prayer cuts to the chase. Prayer is the key to this, and it starts with you. You, as the parent, need to have the prayer um, understanding going in your life, that habit going in your life, in order for you to help your children understand what it is and how to perform it for themselves. So most likely, you need the work, and then you'll be able to do it with your children, and you can do it at the same time with your children. One of the things I recommend, if you're struggling about prayer, um, do a study on the names of God, like Jehovah Adonai, Jehovah Jireh. Um, there's a whole bunch of other names of God, but study those names of God, because in the scriptures those describe attributes of God, and we should know those attributes. We should know the character of God, so that like Daniel, that we'll know how to call upon God. Like David, like we'll know how to call and what to call upon God, and ask him of those specific things, instead of being very general and very vague. A lot of times we just cannot come out, to God and say, "Hey, God, do something." I don't think that's really a good habit to develop. I think the habit of that we should be trying to get to is knowing what to call upon God for, and then it demonstrates, like it did demonstrate for David and for Daniel, their closeness through prayer. Anyway, I feel like I'm just repeating myself, but if you have comments, um, if or questions or feedback, just email Dad Talks to Dads, FBC Adrian MN at gmail.com. Until next time, thank you for listening, and God bless.